thanks everyone for joining us. We're here for the finance track. It's a panel, a discussion, fireside chat, what have you, with Jack Greco, Greg Gallson from CTBK, and Emily Carpenter from Tackle. She's the Director of Revenue Ops there. And the general topic for this particular session is linking operations and finance, and especially when you're starting your company, you're really busy, generating a lot of activity on marketing, on product, on development, on sales, all those things. And it's a question of how do you understand what the impact of all your activity is on your performance? And typically when we look at performance, we're usually looking at some kind of financial statements, or at the very least, cash in the bank. And so the question is, how do you evaluate what activity is worthwhile, what activity is generating what kind of response, and how you go from there? And this kind of breaks out, right? It breaks out across your silos. You've got marketing is doing stuff, you've got sales doing stuff, you've got development and engineers doing stuff. How do you coordinate and evaluate what activity people are doing is appropriate? And that's the crux of this. And I kind of wanted to start it out with, just put out an initial question. If, Jack, Greg, or Emily, when you're looking at a startup, when you're working with a startup, what are some initial thoughts or considerations that you'd put out there for founders right now in our audience list? Anyone can take a first shot here.
You have three really considerate people.
I know.
So
very
you should probably start calling people out.
Jack, since you spoke first, how about you go? How about that?
Oh, okay, so you want to know specifically when I'm looking. So unlike Greg and Emily, I work with like a bunch of different companies, right? And kind of bounce around. So you want to know specifically what I'm looking for on the finance side. How so? How do you want me to answer this?
Yeah. So when you're talking to a startup, when you're talking to the founders,
Yep.
You're looking at their financial statements from an investor perspective, for example,
Yep.
or as an operator, you want to understand what kind of activity is worthwhile activity. How would you guide founders in evaluating what are some key things?
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay. Well, so first of all, like when I look, so hi everybody, good morning. When I look at financial statements, I don't actually start by looking at financial statements, right? I mean, I started looking at like the KPIs that typically should be the header on any type of financial, like non-GAAP financial statement, right? So, and I'm looking to, for me, because I'm in so many different companies that I don't know, mile wide, inch deep. I want to know the way they look at their business. What are the key drivers, right? So if it's a direct to consumer products good company, right? Like, there are things that pop to mind, like what is their churn, their lifetime value, and return on ad spend, right? Where if it's a manufacturing company, I want to understand their operational efficiency and the changes you've made over time and what their work output and their capacity is, right? Like, so for me, it all starts like finance to me is a quantitative version of a story. But you can't just look at financial, like if I showed you financial statements, I didn't tell you what the company was, and it's in standard GAAP, authorized terms, you can't tell. You got your SG&A, you have your OpEx, you have your income statement items, your balance sheet items. It's super confusing, right? The truth is like the financial statement to me is the cheat sheet that goes along with the story. So I want to be able to understand what is the basic principles of the business. Like ACV is a good example. The basic principles of ACV is that you have a place. We have created a platform, literally think of a platform where people find each other and make deals. Right now, we help facilitate that using an auction, so the main drivers there are how many people are showing up, how long are they staying, and how active are they? Because it's a marketplace, right? How much money do they have in their pocket? It's just like, I mean, and so a lot of times, like I describe it in almost a physical representation, and all we've done is digitize that, right? So, obviously in businesses like that, some people, VCs, will want to know what's our GMV, or gross merchandise value, because that's the way they weigh the impact of a marketplace. I'm on the board of a company called TCG, which is another marketplace out in Syracuse, totally different, fancy trading cards like Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh. They look at things a little different. They go, GMV is important, but what we want to do? We want to know how many happy people and how many people consider us first. So these two companies that are both marketplaces, albeit TCG does some of their own fulfillment, like look at KPIs very differently, and that helps me understand the way they look at the business and what they highlight, and maybe why they're accentuating. One company's accentuating net revenue while the other one's accentuating the fact they want to keep burn or churn down, you know? So it's a little anecdotal, but for me, it's the numbers always put color to the black and white. That's the story.
Greg, when you're evaluating and helping companies, from your standpoint as well, and then you're with consulting with an accounting firm, and so you have a little bit more on the GAAP side, and you're looking more heavily at the financials. But from a consulting standpoint, and you kind of span more than just startups, right? You also span some larger companies as well in terms of your experience. Tell me a little bit about that from your perspective.
Yeah, so I think for an established company, it's a little bit different than necessarily than a startup. A lot of the clients that we work with are lower middle market companies, and the KPIs that we would look at are different than what Jack's talking about. Probably, with we've looked at. We'll look at things like the revenue, but I mean, ultimately, you look at revenue growth, EBITDA growth, operating leverage, things like that. But also to make sure that you're maintaining focus on things that actually create shareholder value, and not necessarily, you could be growing revenue at a great rate, but continuing to lose money. And so I think a lot of the times when we're helping the companies, when they get to us, while we do some for early stage companies, it's typically somebody that's more well established, and we're helping them kind of take it to the next level rather than, I would imagine that some of the startups are companies that, the startups have KPIs that don't necessarily relate to profit right away, right? It's more about getting people in there. And as Jack said, maybe, the customer satisfaction or, how many happy users they have, I think is what Jack had said, but, a lot of ours are, let's look at what other people in the industry or other successful companies have done, that you might compete with or might be comparable to, and kind of identify what key performance indicators there are to see how you're pacing against them. And then if you're looking to, potentially sell or raise money, what are the key performance indicators that an investor or purchaser is going to look at? And which ones are the most important ones in terms of levers to get the most value out of your company. So I guess they're different than what Jack had said there, and I don't necessarily know. I'm sure there's some with startups and well-established companies that would be the same, but a lot of them have to do with just making sure that you've got the right key performance indicators and they create shareholder value or cash flow.
And I think I want to circle back to that in a little bit later in the session, because I think there is something to be said about how you scale, right, your KPIs, your performance metrics, and what you're looking at. But before we go there, Emily, some thoughts from you. I know you've done director of RevOps or director of Ops in multiple other companies. Again, tell us a little bit about your background in terms of kind of companies, if you will, and then what do you see as you're operating these things, right?
Certainly. Yeah. So I've been at basically 3 different startup kind of tiers, I would consider, basically 5 million, 10 million, and 25 million mark. And so with those, they've all been for various amounts of time and various amounts of needs, and what I came in to help establish in terms of really setting up initial tech stacks, being able to track those types of KPIs, data points. Oftentimes for me, what I've been really focused on, at least in the last 2 startups, has been around marketing spend, and especially this year in terms of COVID and working from home, the digital spend aspect, and kind of looking at those numbers and KPIs around, last year it used to cost $1.50 to acquire a lead. This year it's costing, $7.50 because everybody's saturating the digital market. This is at a much more granular layer, obviously, but in terms of finance spend and budget allocation, it's been a really interesting transition to see a kind of on the floor level of an operational move on how those businesses have stayed competitive, not only with competitors, but just across the digital market as a whole. Again, especially as everybody's moved online primarily and from home, that type of marketing purview has changed dramatically, I would say, especially in the last 6 to 10 months. So just a really finite example there, Chi. But in terms of KPIs, getting in on the ground floor level in terms of how people are looking at that all roll up to kind of those greater greater KPIs that Jack and Greg were talking about.
It's a great point. And so, and I think that the key thing is like, there are always going to be KPIs. There are always going to be these non-financial things. I made mention of this at an earlier session in this week, is that, financial statements are still a lagging indicator, right? They're telling you the story of what happened. They're not necessarily prepped to give you the details of what's going to happen. We have to have other inputs in on this, right? And that's one of the big things. And the reason for this session is to say, okay, how do we, finance is one piece of it, but how do we use the right kind of metrics, ratios, whatever it might be, to kind of tell the story further down the road. At the startup phase, right, it's much more relevant because everything depends on that growth. Whereas if you're a more established business like Greg, like obviously in the like private equity world and so on, you still have these KPIs. You're still measuring things, but you're just looking at them at a slightly different level. You're looking at them from a different source, perhaps. I do want to talk about a little bit that you made a great point, Emily, about COVID, right? So this pandemic, I kind of want to get everyone's sense of, as you're talking with or working with startups and companies that are on the younger side, like, are you seeing something new in terms of what they're paying attention to? And are you recommending that they start paying attention to something? Emily, you mentioned like marketing, for example, you have more of a focus on digital pieces of that.
Yeah, I can kind of expand a little bit more on that. And I was previously at a digital asset management company where there are basically three major players in the market. And just in terms of, AdWords and spend on places like Capterra, reviews on G2 Crowd, it's just, as people have continued to transition home and really are doing so much of their research, not like they wouldn't do it previously online, but, maybe they would interact with a coworker or, another type of business, or colleague at an event, for example. Like, we would drive so many top of the funnel leads just from events alone, and so from shutting that off, we had to really refocus onto these online webinars, online events, that were still cost, but were they cost effective? Like I mentioned earlier, in terms of paid ad spend, really looking at the lead acquisition cost all the way down to the customer acquisition cost. That increased, generally speaking, across the board, especially in the first 2 quarters of this year, mostly just due to the market being competitive in terms of cost per click. And so that was just something financially we had to be aware of, and we had to be able to pivot internally from the go-to-market budget that we hadn't obviously pre-planned for. So it was just, we had to be quick on our feet. Otherwise we were going to be last to the party and, show up on the second page of Google all of a sudden, and more now than ever, it was critical to be at the top and to be willing to spend that type of cash if you wanted to stay as far as the startup digital asset management market, in first or second place. So,
yeah, Jack, like when you're talking to all the companies that you're advising and so on, what are you noticing in the past few months? I mean, some startups have either ground to a halt, some are doing even better because of various tailwinds, right? But in any case, founders are looking at their businesses a little differently. They're maybe paying more attention to other things. What are you seeing out there?
So look, I think everybody's become a lot more, like the blinders have come off a little bit. Like when I was thinking about the beginning of the year, a handful of businesses said, here's our plan. Their assumption list that went into like their financial model was not robust with the consideration for something like this happening, right, with COVID and everything. And so, yeah, I mean, it's easy to say, okay, now, like, could something like this happen again? I think it's now stretched what is reasonable to consider when you're looking forward and taken that narrow band and widened it a little bit. So I'll give you an example. Like I'm an investor and a longtime supporter of a sneaker company called Forsake. They were one of the 43 North winners. They won $500,000 a couple of years ago. In great company, but like they had, I remember being in board meetings with them saying, hey, look, like it's tough funding this product and financing this product. Maybe we should stick more with brick and mortar as your sales outlet, than this true omni-channel approach you guys are pushing with, direct to consumer. because again, we leaned heavily on cost per acquisition, return on ad spend, stuff like that. It's a consumer product play, right? And the numbers were good. They were hitting their 3-to-1, but they didn't think they could really juice it that much more. And now they look back and they're like, oh my God, thank God we were doing that, because, the retail branches that we had been working with, that we relied on to be able to use factoring or be able to get bank financing around. Because remember, the kind of customer you have and the kind of customer you can give finance are two completely different things. This is for a hardware product company, right? I mean, software, it's, all hell breaks loose. But I think people are starting to look at their business from different perspectives. Look, we're getting ready to go into one of the most contentious election seasons in a while. I'm a partner on a natural CPG company locally called Azuna. And, we're like, hey, look, we were talking to our marketing guy, and this is going to be mayhem for like the next 5-6 weeks. Ad spends are just through the roof because people are just paying for eyeballs, so I think people are just being more open about what are the impacting, like what do they control? What do they impact? And I'm seeing, like, even in the financial models I see a broadening, and I challenge people to broaden what their assumption base is, right? It's no longer like, here's our base case, here's our high, here's our low. I don't know what the hell those three things mean, right? Here is what happens if certain things start changing, right? Like if one of our channels starts to, that we've forever trusted, goes away. I kind of think of it like when the Buffalo Bills practice, and you see them, like, obviously they didn't do it this year because they weren't at St. Chad Fisher, but you see it in preseason. They're constantly jiggling the offensive line. They're like, okay, assume this guy got injured, put somebody else in. Assume this guy gets injured, right? And like, you almost need to think, any part of your business can be injured or hampered, when at the same time it can like greatly excel and have a benefit. So how quickly can you adjust to those things? How quickly can you identify them? Do you already have a plan to adjust for them? And how quickly can you execute on that? Like, that is what I'm seeing that's different now. And I'm that much more excited to be in early stage companies because they have the ability to be nimble, right? They don't have 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 employees that there's a bureaucratic red tape everywhere, and I think that's one of the reasons some of them have been where amongst their peers, certain of these companies have excelled. I think the smaller ones have excelled, right? I mean, who's when your house is on fire, who gets out? The mouse, because the mouse has got a million ways to get out, and he's small, right? And he doesn't care about anything, and that's the way startups are. So, that's kind of the way I think of it.
Yeah, and I think you both made a little bit of a mention on this, and some of the companies that I advise, we look at their financial models are like the best place to have these conversations. And, just a quick plug, we're having a session on financial modeling Friday. But the reason why I bring that up is it's where your assumptions get added and tracked and tested, right? So I'm working with a company right now that's actually seeing a little bit of tailwinds because of education, right? I'm actually home with my kids in the next door. They're doing school remotely today. And there's a whole world around the education market right now in schools for, hey, I need some kind of remote tool to help me, relay this content that I need to relay to my students. In some cases, they're doing hybrid models and so on. So what a company starts looking at changes because of whatever happened in the market, right? So now this one company we're working with, they're having to evaluate, hey, let's take a look at, they were a smart panel company originally before COVID hit. When COVID came through, they're like, I wonder if we can get into thermal scanners because they want kids who are coming through the building to get scan temperature checked, right? But they did a pretty hard pivot, and it's they're selling equipment, so they just had to source it and stock it and sell it. But they had to think differently about how quickly they could get the scanners, how much effort it was to get it installed, and so on. So their KPIs, even for a short period of time, changed. And I think that's the key. That's one thing that I want to put down as a takeaway for companies is that you have your KPIs and you have the things that you're going to evaluate on a routine basis as business goes on. But you also need to leave, it goes back to Jack's point of broadening it, you've got to leave space in there for weird things happening or just asking a slightly unexpected question around it. Greg, I think that this often comes up with some more mature companies, right? Because they're in a cycle, right? They have product market fit. They're not worried about product market fit. They're just worried about growing their market share, if you will. And it's a question of like, how do you do that, right? In terms of, you're still going to have a question about what kind of activities do I need to focus on to increase my either revenue, increase my customer spend, increase my order size, whatever it might be. When you're talking with more established companies, right? And the reason why I want to talk about this is it's where you, as a startup, you're going to look towards, right? You want to become an established company. So from your perspective, how do you advise more established companies on the KPIs, on the non-financial aspects, and how they model things out? And do you work at a financial model level, from a budgeting standpoint, if you will, or how does that work out for you?
Yeah, I don't know if I ever used the phrase I think that Jack used, like the expanding the assumptions, but I think like that's something that we've done a lot with younger companies, but also mature companies. We've kind of they've had many years of good stable growth, right? It's been a good economy, and they haven't necessarily had to take a look at some of these shocks to their revenue or cash flow, right? That they've encountered over the past 8 months. So I think like our models, what we've done is kind of changed to to consider more of these events that like nobody really necessarily, nobody was really necessarily thinking that they weren't going to have any cash flow coming in for 3 months, right? Even if they had people that were continuing to work and service their clients, because it was just so these like cash flow assumptions that were never considered before have now kind of been built into some of the models that we're doing to make people feel more comfortable about it, and hopefully we don't necessarily encounter something like this regularly, but at least I think for established companies, but also younger companies that are run by younger people who have been running through a period of time when everything was kind of going well macroeconomically. This is it was just a good exercise. As long as they were able to survive it, or are able to survive it, it's a good exercise in stress testing, some of the KPIs and some of the other inputs that we had in the models.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I like to do with companies is, especially established companies, and this kind of helps from a startup standpoint. It's more on the forecasting, on the modeling piece of it. But there's a corollary, I think, with established companies, which is, I'm a big fan of this. The people I work with typically are not, because zero-based budgeting. I don't know if you all probably are familiar with that, but for our audience, zero-based budgeting asks every department to justify every dollar. And when you have an established company, right, this is a painful process because they're like, I've always had this money for X, Y, or Z. Why do I have to tell you why? And it's not even because I want to see the dollars in there, right? It's because I want you to question the assumptions of what you need to get your work done, to deliver whatever value that increase shareholder value. And that exercise is something that I think, and correct me if any of you think this is incorrect, I think both startup founders can do, as well as established founders who have a decent run of money coming in, is go back now that you're clocking in maybe 10 million in ARR or whatever, go back and evaluate what really is moving the needle. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good exercise to go through, because there's so many things. Again, established companies, they've had a lot of time. They've had many years potentially of a good run where they didn't necessarily need to check every single line item on the budget, but to go through that exercise and have them justify it, kind of. Maybe to more of a to think like a startup that has finite funds, and to really confirm that they actually need these things that they've got, or to verify that there's not something. We've come in this with our own businesses, that sometimes as we've expanded subscription services that we're using to identify like deals and transactions that are occurring, sometimes you realize that, okay, well, we've had these other ones for the past few years, but we're on to this new one now, and it's actually quite robust, right? So like we're already, we're paying for some of the services multiple times, or some of the services that we've brought on afterwards are encapsulated in some of the previous ones that we've had for 5 years or something like that. And so to actually go through that is, is a good exercise.
Emily, like along those lines, I feel like marketing is one of those hotspot departments, if you will, where you could easily, overspend, or you could easily over rationalize. How do you work with companies and help them kind of keep that lean, and also help identify that, hey, this activity that I want to do, this particular spate of ads that I want to run, or account-based account-based marketing, or whatever it might be. How do you work with the organization leaders to say, hey, if we do X, this is what we're going to come down to? Like, I think we can increase revenue by whatever. Like, how do you tie that in for them?
Yeah, it's a really hard balance, Chi. I would say mostly because people are so passionate. I think marketers, especially, historically, I've always believed that marketing and sales are very different beasts. People are passionate about go-to-market subjects and personalities, so I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, and especially with marketing, I've always found it's a good mix of qualitative and quantitative analysis, because there is passion around programs that people are running, right? I've had really excellent marketers who said, no, this is going to move the needle, right? Like, running this type of program is going to get, X amount of people in the door that are absolutely going to convert. And then when it falls flat, it's really sometimes a shock to the ego to say, oh, wow, I was really wrong, right? So being gentle, I think for me has always been like, I understand this, these are the budgets that you want to run, but, looking at historics has always just been an asset for me in terms of how programs have performed, even on a holistic demand gen type level of, webinar programs versus direct mail programs versus ad spend, with digital. And kind of to your point earlier, Chi, about the zero-based budgeting, going through that action, especially right before we were looking for a round of funding or an acquisition piece like that, I've been at places where we've really had to tighten up before we were looking at those options, more so because, we wanted the bank, statements to be in the very best position possible for somebody to come in and say, oh yeah, they're really tight. They really know what every line item means here. And so oftentimes, in reading my mind, she obviously is that marketing has been kind of the hardest place to kind of put those bootstraps on sometimes, in terms of like, guys, we got to cut back for a couple quarters here, and let's be creative about how we can get some lead acquisition in the door in other ways. So yeah, that's a good question.
And I feel like startups have an easier time to, as Jack mentioned, you're much more nimble. You're mice, not to be pejorative, but you can shift faster if something's not jiving. But that also means, right, that founders have to be pretty cognizant about whether or not something's working, and kind of make a call on the sooner side. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, but so I mean, you got to remember, startups operate in a different way, right? So like I love hearing about established companies. I could never do one. I'm wearing like a fraternity shirt that I had when I was 18. You don't get away with that in places where you were supervised. But like, I love hearing this, because like, it's why startups work. The fact you're talking about zero-based budgeting and that you're worried about this, like startups are like mad scientists, right? And what you don't realize, like a mad scientist, good startups try things and understand what's going on all the time, right? Like Tackle is right in this brackish area where they're a startup. They just took some legitimate money from a legitimate player in Bessemer, and Bessemer wants them to stop being so much of a mad scientist and start being a little bit more polished. But like, what happens is when you're a mad scientist and you focus on your experiments, like, you know them in and out, and you forget about eating, you forget about where you sleep, you don't care if you have a cable on or off, you don't even care if they cut it. And so startups become so driven, they stop worrying about zero-based budgeting and start looking for like the best holes and the best opportunities. Like, I call startups mice, because a mouse can go in any house. He doesn't have a mortgage. He survives, right? I mean, like, so it's interesting when you hear these things, because like the perspective is so different. Like, I've seen startups that have done 10 things wrong in a row and can still go raise money to go do the 11th thing. You can't do that at a corporation, right? Like, Delaware North isn't pivoting to like all of a sudden do something tremendously different. Like, they can't do that. So it's like, it's really, I'm taking a lot from this, learning like, oh my God, like this is why disruption is so not easy to do, but the fact that it can continue to happen, because the focus set is like, yeah, it depends what your return on ad spend is, and it depends on all this stuff. And the little founders, the mice, care about that also. But we can start looking at things in an entirely different world because we're not carrying this train car of baggage behind us that like is pushing us in the direction that we're going, and we can pivot and jump a little bit quicker. So
No,
I mean, it's just interesting seeing the dichotomy between the two of them.
It is.
They're all businesses.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, which is, and the takeaway of anything here is that startups are mice. Just have that down there. But the whole point, I think what you're saying is absolutely true, is that founders have a very keen pulse on almost the entire package of their startup, right? And so they are going to experiment, and they're going to respond based on how that experiment turned out in very quick iterations. Or technically you should, right? Like if your experiments are not working, and I guess that's the one thing I want to ask about is, for startup founders who are experimenting and they understand this piece, at what point, because part of the difficulty of that passion too is saying, hey, this might not be the right thing to do, but you're still passionate about that particular idea or that particular form of execution, and saying, when do I nix it because it's not working, and how do I pay attention to the signals that say I need to nix this and I need to move on to something else?
You have to be obsessed with your experiment, right? I mean, like, it needs to be what you're thinking about it all the time, talking about it, right? I mean, that's my simple answer.
I think one of the key things that I'm learning from this is that there is a shift, right, from being startup founder to getting to a point where you're polished. Maybe that happens at your Series A, right, where your investors are saying, hey, you've been running a little wild. That's great. Keep that wildness, but maybe tame it down a little bit, jump a little bit less high. And I think that discipline comes when you start raising funds. And I think it's great to have a way to go through that experimentation phase quickly earlier on, as opposed to when you're actually getting ready to find money for people to invest in, right? I think that your pre-seed, your seed gives you the most flexibility. And you don't want to get hung up on, what are my financials saying? What are my are they in perfect order? Did my bookkeeper do the right thing on this piece? I think it's more about, am I seeing the results of my experiments faster and knowing where to look for those? Is that a fair statement?
To me, yeah. I mean, it's all about the magic of the metered response, right? I mean, we can use all these trite things like metered response and deciphering the signal from the noise, but like, the undeniable fact that a big company or small is you need to know every single thing about your business. Like, you have to, right? And I mean, founders, one of the cool thing about it is because on day one, they're responsible for everything. They at least are keenly aware to it. As long as you're not starting a company with a group of 10, you have to know where everything is in your company, just like where I have to know where everything is in my house as a single dad, and then as you build a team, things get easier, but you still remain, that consciousness remains of what all happens. And that is what ultimately, with experience creates this intuition to be able to know what to look at when.
When any of you are advising your peers or your clients or your portfolio companies, think back to a couple of times where you had to kind of come in and say, hey, you're looking at the wrong thing. Does anything come up to you that you'd be glad to share, where you're having to tell founders that they need to think about what their experiment is a little differently and what they should be paying attention to?
Yeah, Chi, when I was working for a company called Full Contact, they were a data enrichment company basically, but one of their core products actually, in the base of the idea of the experiment, as Jack so fondly puts it, is that their ideal state was they wanted that your contact database was singular, clean, enriched, and it was really an app on a phone, right? But what come to find out after being in the business for 4 or 5 years, like that wasn't making money. What was making money was the data enrichment side. It was really more of a traditional like Clearbit competitor. And it was really hard, I think, especially for the founders to see what their original science experiment, what their passion was about what they wanted to solve wasn't making the business money at the rate that they needed to, stay alive and continue to hire. And, being able to have those tough conversations, especially with the leadership team around, the sales team isn't making anything from this. Like, this isn't a good use of their time, of our investors' time, and those conversations are hard to have, again, because I think around the passion of the originator around the idea. But let's take what good things came out of that original product and take that to market and continue to land and expand and to really, really put, gas on the fire in terms of this is selling and this is actually making the business money. But, it's hard, I think, especially for the original, chief product officer to say, damn, this hasn't worked, but to be able to say to them, well, look, we've got this out of it and this can keep the business alive and, keep the money flowing through the door. So I think those are always hard because, again, people are really driven by what their original science experiment was or what they really feel like was going to change the B2B SaaS platform, basically.
That's helpful. Jack or Greg, anything come to mind that where you had to, as an example for the audience where, they've been looking at their particular product, and you've had to kind of course correct them and say, look, you're looking to optimize this particular piece of your product, right? So I'm kind of thinking maybe, Jack, your ACV example, right? You're a marketplace, and or the comparison between ACV and TCG, right? They're both marketplaces, but they're looking at slightly different things to measure their success. And what would have happened if they didn't, right? And those kinds of course corrections.
Well, I might still be there if they looked at things differently. I wouldn't have got the hell out. But no, I'm saying, I'm half joking, half not. Look, none of us have the hand of God, right? I mean, so I can't course correct somebody. I can maybe do some, drawing in the sand and say, what do you think about this, right? But one thing I've learned, and this is as a pretty abrasive guy that probably comes off as fairly polarizing, is tact is important in all of this, right? So I'll tell you this, I've literally seen the same company get the same advice from two different people and react to it entirely different based on the source of where that information is coming. So, I mean, it might have been a nuance in what you were saying, Chi, but big company or small company, we're all human beings. We all got egos. We all overreact and underreact and have fears and are too proud and all that shit. And the thing we got to realize is it's not the medicine that's going to make things better, right? It's the way you think about the medicine. It's the openness, right? I know this is coming off as quasi holistic, but I mean, the thing is that businesses self-correct themselves, and they're a living organism. TCG or ACV or Forsake or any of the other, I don't even know how many companies that I got a finger in or a toe in or some other body part in. All of them are their own organism, right? And so when you start thinking of it having its own personality and its own thing, I remember sitting in meetings saying, we can't do this to the company, right? It wasn't I can't do this to you. It wasn't we can't do this. It's the company's got to be, the company has eyes and ears too. It can see and hear what's going on, and we need to be able to appreciate it. And I've seen big company and small, not that I've been in that many big ones, but it's easy to see what's going on. They're big, tall buildings with a lot of glass, right? They're not underground like the rest of us. But, I've seen it time and time again. It really comes down to, do you let something become what it is? Do you let the puppy grow into its paws? Or do you try and make it something else? And I know I'm talking qualitatively on this whole thing, but the truth is, course correction, all I can ever do is sit down with somebody and say, I got a different way of looking at it. Here's what I see. Take it as an observation from a fellow physician. I'm not a hand surgeon. I'm a brain surgeon. But I'll tell you what, this is what that looks like to me, and take it what you want with it. And the funny thing is it matters so much what spoon the medicine's on, depending on how it goes down, right? So, I don't know.
Yeah, I
Maybe
mean,
you took something from that. Maybe it was mindless rambling, but I hope you got something from it.
this is all about mindless rambling. It's okay. But no, I think to your point, it goes back to what Emily had said, right? It's like, how do you talk to folks that you do need to help course correct? Not that you can course correct them, but how do you talk to them about it? I think one of the, and Greg, you can chime in here, because one of the, I think, benefits of being a consultant, that they're kind of paying you for it. So if you don't take their advice, well, that's effectively on you. But you know, the value of somebody coming in from a different perspective and saying, hey, look, this is how I've seen this take place. These are the things that these founders or CEOs are paying attention to. And because I think that there is, a relationship between your business model and this person's business model, you may want to consider X, right? I'll give you a great example. There's one company that I've worked with, and right now they're selling licenses on an annual basis. It's all well and good, but they're actually in a marketplace, and so it's a question of are we looking at how their customers are, how much of their customers are transacting once they have that platform? Like, are your customers able to generate more revenue because of it, because of your service? And if so, then you need to start looking at how much, because that's going to make or break whether or not they come back, or they're going to add more, or buy more from you because of the fact that it's helping their business. Taking a step further down the line than just looking at your immediate customers.
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess to kind of go off of maybe that, but also what Jack said, I can't really follow up on what Jack said, because I think maybe he thought it was rambling, but it was well said. I think that there's two different people that can come in and give, and again, from the consultancy, right? There's two different people that can come in and tell a company the same thing, and they may listen to one person and not listen to somebody else. However, to bring it to the KPI indication of it is that, like, if you can actually, the delivery of the message may be different coming from different people, but if you can somehow quantify it with some KPI, either your own, or your customers, right, and show that to them. I mean, that's as much as you can do, right? I mean, you can't. There's so many times, clients and companies that we work with that we provide. I don't know what the percentage is, the success rate of like advice that we give and advice that they take, but it's really not that high. I mean, like a lot of the times it's, but the times that they do take it is when it's supported by KPIs for them or their customers, and you can quantify and say, I understand you don't want to do this. I understand that, you're experimenting with something else, or you're so focused on something else, but like this is the direction we've really got to be going in because of these 4 or 5 reasons, and the impact on the bottom line, or the ability to provide cash flow to invest in some other, project that inside the company that somebody else wants to work on. So I don't know, like I said, I can't, what Jack said was good, but I think like part of it also is just that, like, the support of, that we deal with that regularly, but supporting it with KPIs, showing people like this is the actual financial implication of why we're saying such a thing, at least may help that success rate a little bit.
Fair point. I kind of wanted to take a quick second. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to let the audience know that if you have any questions or anything like that specific, please open up your Q&A tab on your Zoom and send some in. I'll try to build those into here in the next 15 minutes. I want to talk a little bit more tactically, right? So we talk about KPIs, we talk about measuring things, and we talk about paying attention to certain non-financial pieces, right? So this is a key attention on activity. And from some of the experiences, and again, feel free to chime in, how you track, what you look at, and setting those systems up, I think becomes a little bit more important. Now, when I say systems, I don't mean crazy systems. It could be Google Sheets, right? But the reason why I would talk about this is we're talking about linking your operations and your activity to a performance metric of some sort and saying, this is what I looked at and this is how I got there. And I think that a lot of startups oftentimes, we'll buy software, we'll buy tools and things like that. We'll use spreadsheets and so on for very functional reasons at first. We're not usually thinking about I need to go, I want this as a historical store so I can go back and take a look at it again. Is that a fair statement? Like, do you guys come across that in terms of when you're talking with some startups saying, you know, you have your data and so on all these places, but you've been using it in a way that you don't give yourself the ability to go back and pay attention to some data?
Yeah, I think especially in startups, it's like a love relationship with Google Suite in terms of Google Sheets and Docs. And for me, as I guess as I mature in my career, they become like lost toys, right? It's like, oh, somebody did a spreadsheet once that had cool forecasting, that had all this modeling built in, and then nobody can find it like 3 months later. And I think especially operationally, that's why I always try and come in and say, folks, we gotta get some tools in place that we don't have these lost toys just floating around our G Suite. And people, again, are passionate about like, look at this thing that I built, that I've made. And, something like a Salesforce or a Marketo or a HubSpot isn't always solving those problems. And, especially financially, that in the financial tool suite, when I started with you, what was the tool that I told you that I used to use that was so horrible? I can't even remember the name of it, but NetSuite, right? And I was like, there's nothing to do out of like, this is so horrible. So I think when you're thinking about tools and when you're thinking about what you want to measure and how you want to, keep it in line and clean and organized, to me, it's never a bad investment to get yourself into an early stage. And this isn't trying to be a plug for Salesforce in any capacity, but they've really changed their way you can get into their market in terms of pricing for startups and, lower level tiers of the tool, because you don't want to keep adding new people to your organization and then try and explain this, idea you had on a Google Sheet like 3 months ago that seemed so cool, but you can't articulate it anymore, or in a way that makes sense process-wise or operationally. So I've just always been a huge advocate of getting your SaaS tool stack in a place early and often, because you will reap the benefits as the business continues to grow and, change in terms of what you're bringing on for personnel. I just think, I can't tout enough how important it is just to get a really centered source of truth for you and your business as early and as often as possible. So just that's my hill I stand on, and I love a good Google Sheet as much as the other person, but it becomes a bad habit for me oftentimes. So.
It becomes important though. Go ahead. Sorry, Jack.
No, go ahead, Chief.
No, I think it's an interesting tension, right? Where you want to have something simple at first, especially depending on how early you are, right? You want to have something simple, but I think that the thing that I would say is startups should and founders should, find the tool that helps them most to functionally do their work and accomplish what they're trying to accomplish, but should always have an eye out towards, at some point I'm going to need to look back on this and evaluate how it went. Is that different advice, maybe, Jack, from what you try to give your startups?
Look, I mean, I'm a sicko, right? I don't use anything but like CSV polls and Excel, right? Like Google Sheets. Look, if you don't pay Google, they get all your data, right? So there's a reason why I have like a 2010, slightly upgraded, workbook that I keep everything in. So look, I totally get it. It's both a blessing and a curse on some of this. I mean, I used to, even in my last days at like ACV, I would pour over, like basically just raw. I had a guy there, Rob, who was a great guy, and we had a very interesting relationship. Because when we brought him on, I go, look, I don't really know what I'm asking for, but I need it to look like this. And he would give me like the raw data because I didn't even trust the data visualization tool, right? I mean, like I needed to see it. Like I remember he was sending me files. Like, every day I got every single transaction ever from ACV, and I would run numbers in it, right? And so I totally get what you're saying, and it makes it really tough to operate a business like that. That's why I tell people, like, I'm a little business guy. I'm not a big business guy. I don't even know how you expand to that, But I can tell you, having somebody that just is all over and kind of Joneses. Sorry, I'm glitching a little bit on my side. I hope I'm not glitching with you. Having somebody that owns this, like a numbers czar, that is well compensated in terms of cap on the cap table, that is like thoroughly enjoys getting this and being kind of a data hog, is I've played that role to a bunch of companies, and I appreciate it when somebody else does. And it's the only way I've ever found to be able to manage my way out of a paper bag of getting a company launched, right? Because it is really hard, you know. It's really tricky, you know. So I can only imagine what it's like for you guys to tackle. It's got to be chaos. But.
That sounds like chaos, Jack. That was very scary to hear. That's how.
Right.
That's just one worksheet, one workbook from 2010.
One
Excel.
person, no redundancy. I have to be invincible, right?
I run everything
Right.
Lotus 1, 2, 3, just so you know.
Yeah.
Very good.
You do what? Was that you? I didn't hear that.
I run everything off of Lotus 1, 2, 3.
There you go.
Just a
There you
step
go.
above, like, a 12-column ledger kind of thing. But it's no, but I think even big companies have this, right? And I'm like, let's be honest. Big companies have just as much data and software and system sprawl, right, as a startup will. And because you're growing and you're evaluating as you go, you have new people come in, old people leave, whatever it might be, and you're going to have all these tools and sheets and data stores out there. And I mean, how many integration platforms are there out there where you tie one system to another to get you what you need in an easier way? There's more of those now, right? So it's like, this is not necessarily saying that if you do X early on, you're going to be hunky-dory throughout. But it's more about, making sure that you understand the difference between, right, the functional pieces of a software and your analytical aspects of that software, right? The ability to go back, like I'll give you a great example. One of the previous companies I worked with, and I'm a moderator, I shouldn't be talking this much, but one of the previous companies I worked with, they had all these Excel files that eventually got corrupt, because that happens, right? This was an older company. I'll just put that out there. The information store that everyone essentially relied on got corrupted, and so now we had nothing and had to rebuild the information from scratch, and that was a very brutal process for the company to go through. So it's a caveat, if you will. Don't go overboard maybe on what kind of tools you're buying today. If it's free, that's great. Just make sure that you have your data that you can go back on and evaluate, so that you don't lose track of what it is that matters to your company. Is that a good recap?
Excellent, Chi. Well done.
Yeah. I always think of it, and this is going to even sound more simple. There's this it's like a Buddhist thing called sand mandala, where like they used to make these amazingly intricate colored sand sculptures, and as soon as they were done, they would blow them away and wash them away. And that's the way I always treated models, right? I mean, they could be ridiculously sophisticated and unique, but if you didn't constantly rebuild them over, I was building a new model probably once every 4 to 6 weeks at ACV from scratch, and I do this for other companies, and it's the only way. It's almost every time you do it, you appreciate a different place where you source the data and you understand the data and you see the
Right.
data, and it allows you. You can't do that in a big company. You could do that in a small company that does one thing, right? And I like startups that do one thing. I don't like startups that do 10 things. So maybe it creates a self-selecting phenomenon who I spend time with. But, I think if you just keep pushing yourself to saying, what if everything went corrupt today? What would we do? Again, now is some of that preparatory action to be able to say, how do I rethink of my company today? Because the person I was yesterday, my mind I had yesterday, and the experience I had yesterday, totally different than what it is today. And maybe I can do a better version of it. So.
Yeah, as a person who enjoys financial models, they're also reading somebody else's models is painful, because you have to kind of understand where their mind was at. So I don't know, maybe Jack, you and I have more in common than we might want to admit.
Yeah, well, everybody, a lot of people read this newsletter I send out every Wednesday, and that's as much confusion and abysmal craziness, and so sometimes people enjoy things that are odd and strange. You'd be surprised. So.
And from a big company standpoint too, and like I've worked with some larger organizations, and Greg, you could probably attest to this, is you eventually need somebody, as you mentioned, Jack, right? You eventually need somebody to just hold the reins on all this data that's getting generated and to make sense of it. And if it's somebody like who likes to get the raw data and build their visualizations from scratch, or just somebody who understands what those incremental changes are going to be, I think that's important to keep an eye towards. Again, I don't think any of this needs to detract startup founders from doing what they're doing, right? But it's just a paying attention to the history that's gone by, having your history of your experiments, right? Thomas Edison, however many experiments he ran through, he had to know what not to do again so that he's not repeating the same mistake, right? And knowing where to look for that. Most scientists carry notebooks around, I think. Hardcore scientists. Yes. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I think that I haven't seen any particular questions come through or anything in the chats yet. I think what I want to do is really quickly give you guys a chance to give some parting thoughts. Right. This is about operations, about finance, but from a parting thoughts standpoint, what are some things that you would recommend that startups do, founders do, in terms of paying attention to certain things and kind of ignoring other things, right? Anything that comes to mind right off the bat?
I guess my thought was, and I don't want to take Emily's, right, but it's kind of off of what she said before, is that again, I'm not as involved in the startups as definitely as Jack is, but I mean potentially if as you start softwares or as you start building, but they build have it kind of set up so that you can scale right early on, right, so that have it built in a way and structured in a way so that like when you actually really start growing and you start adding people and onboarding folks and getting everybody up to speed on stuff, it's such an arduous task of going all over the place and trying to teach everybody everything that's in these little nooks and all over. It's very separated in different programs. I would think that as early as you can, and again, this may not be practical, but I would think that as early as you can, to set the company up to be able to scale, because hopefully sooner than later you will be, and it's going to be a big pain in the neck down the line trying to get everything aligned.
Yeah, that's great, Greg. I couldn't agree more. Operationally, and an exercise I used to do, especially with my more early stage startups, is every 6 months we would actually look at the KPIs that we were measuring and really see what that meant to us, if that makes sense for everyone. Like, okay, does measuring this KPI, did that bring us any value? Did that bring us any quantitative change? Like, could we actually what was that of value even to measure? And especially early stage, I think you feel like you want to measure everything. But again, oftentimes you don't have either A, enough data, B, enough deals done, C, a slew of reasons. So I just would encourage people, like, it's okay to change what your KPIs are, especially as your business grows. And I think there's so much out there in terms of all of these, measurements. And at minimum, yeah, you want to measure your MRR and your ARR and all those types of things. But at a finite level, especially go-to-market team, like, you might be looking at different KPIs across the board there. And so don't be so hard on yourself in terms of whether or not, those are moving the needle or changing those or getting rid of measuring something, along the way. You can always come back to it. I just think people will get really hung up on, these are the benchmark measurements we need to be at. And, that's great to be there and great to be thinking that way. But just try and be kind to yourself in terms about those measurements, because you can get so hung up and not continue to like move the business forward or make the decisions you need, because sometimes those KPIs are paralyzing, I think, and that can be tough. So yeah, that would just be my sentiment about KPIs and operations. So
I'll keep it brief. Being half in a lot of conversations is not as good as being all in a fewer number. So I tell people all the time, take your email off your phone. Don't look at data on your phone. Like, break all that stuff out and make sure you have a good division between when you are working on the operations and the finance of the business and when you aren't, and try and do the best you can to do that with your mind as well, because it is easy, especially in a startup, to become obsessive, and that's not a good thing. And success in the business doesn't mean success in life necessarily. So, I mean, I've never, at least recently, ever did any type of, like, I wouldn't look at daily numbers. I didn't check it like the stock market. I would break my time out typically I would do it in the morning before everybody got up. And that's when I would go through my numbers and have like my quiet time to be able to go through it. So I just suggest making sure you keep that Voltairean, division of church and state, and make sure you don't become one with the business and not one with reality.